All right, so Simba runs away from the kingdom out into the desert. Now, why is that? Well, you remember, and maybe you don't know it, the story of Exodus, when Moses takes the Hebrews out of Egypt, they end up in a desert. Well, why? Well, it's because when you leave a kingdom, no matter how tyrannical, you still fall into disorder. You're out in a place that's desert, there's no civilization there. You know, that's what happened to Iraq after the Americans went in. You know, the Americans, the neocons, were all convinced that the Iraqis would welcome them with open arms and there would be this smooth transition to democracy. Same idea in Libya. It's like, no, that's not what happens. What happens is the state devolves into a desert chaos. And maybe then you can make order, but probably not. And so Simba has left the kingdom, and the first thing that happens is he damn near dies in the desert. And so Simba's out there in the desert. He's left his family and the comforts of home, and he's discovered by Pumbaa and what was the little rat's name? Timon? Yes, he's a meerkat, right? Which are very cool things. And they discover him, and this is sort of his transition into adolescence. And he kind of finds, and this is, I would say, more typical of the male transition into adolescence, because females, of course, hit puberty so much younger. The males who aren't very attractive when they're young, and just starting to undergo puberty, they're not very attractive to females. They tend to clump together in gangs and manage the transition over what it could be 7 years. So, and that's what happens here, is Simba joins this little gang of, you know, these guys are all right, but, you know, they're a little on the primordial side, you might say. You know, one of them is basically just a walking gastrointestinal tract, and the other one is, he's not so bad, but he's like, you know, a foot high, really, what good is he? And so he's got some second-rate companions out here past the desert, but he's out of childhood now, and now he enters the adolescent world. And what happens here is that very quickly in the film, he goes from being a little cub to a full adolescence, and there's about a 5-minute transition, and so it's the next stage in his development. And now he's out there in this paradise, which is kind of strange because adolescence really is no picnic. But the idea here is that he really doesn't have any responsibilities, right? None. And that is one thing about adolescence is, and even the stage of life that you guys are at, is you have lots to do, but you're not really responsible for anyone other than yourself. And so even though you might be quite burdened with your current responsibilities, it's nothing compared to what it would be like when you have responsibility for children, for example, or for the people that are working for you or whatever. So anyways, out here, it's a kind of impulsive place as well. And adolescence is like that. We've had high school students try to do the future authoring program, you know, where they have to think 3 to 5 years down the road. It's like, forget that. They just can't do it. And I've watched them, and what happens is you immediately become aware of just how little high school students know when they're like 15 or 16. 3 to 5 years, forget it. They don't have the world knowledge to project themselves out that far in the future, not even close. And so we've built a high school version that helps them design a better future 3 to 6 months down the road, and even that's really pushing it. But, you know, adolescents are more impulsive, and they live more for the moment. And there's some utility in that. I mean, being impulsive and living for the moment is one of the things that gets you pregnant as a teenager, and that is certainly one way that the species has managed to propagate itself. And so positive emotion and impulsivity are very tightly linked. And so he's out there in this adolescent delusional fantasy. That might be one way of thinking about it, but more importantly, he's out there where he's in a domain now where the impulses of the moment basically take precedence. And I think they sing some song about, Hakuna Matata, right, which basically means do whatever you want and tomorrow will take care of itself, or something like that. So it's very impulsive and lacks all responsibility. One of the things that I would recommend to you if you want to protect yourself from ideological possession, shall we say, is that when you hear people speak politically and they don't say anything about your responsibilities, you should probably stop listening to them. Because whenever they're trying to offer you something, if it doesn't come along with an equivalent cost, there's something being hidden from you. And they're appealing to the part of you that's, well, I would say, at best adolescent. So, all right, so anyways, he's out there in his little adolescent paradise and with his dopey chums, and back at Pride Rock, things are not good, right? Scar, who's arrogant and refuses to learn, and who will not establish a reasonable relationship with the females. All he does is tyrannize over them. He ends up ruling over a completely barren landscape. And that's really what happens in totalitarian states. And we also know, quite interestingly, is that one of the best predictors of economic development in a state is the degree to which they extend rights to women. It's one of the best predictors. And I would say, well, if you're going to tyrannize your own women, you're going to tyrannize everything. You're going to tyrannize ideas, you're going to tyrannize structures. Like, if you have to enslave your own women, you've adapted a pretty damn pathological view of the world, and the probability that that narrow, constrained, restricted viewpoint is going to pay off for you economically is extraordinarily low. So anyways, SCAR, it's like what happened in the Soviet Union. You know, part of the reason it collapsed by 1989 is that it just could not move any farther. It was like this really complicated motor that was worn completely out, that no one had ever taken care of, and it just ground to a halt. It just stopped working because it didn't work. And so if you're totalitarian and you won't update your system and adjust it, then it wears out and grinds to a halt, and everything becomes unproductive. Now, it's not easy to figure out what makes a society productive, because you might say, well, it's natural resources or something like that. First of all, natural resources are very often a curse to a country because they produce corruption. They call that the Dutch disease. There's a reason for that. You can look it up. But natural resources in and of themselves are by no means sufficient to guarantee the well-being of a country. Japan has virtually no natural resources at all, and it's really rich. And one of the prime natural resources actually seems, maybe there's two. One is honesty, another is trust. And if you can set up a society where people are roughly honest, which means they do what they say they're going to do, and where the default bargaining position on both sides is trust, then the probability that that culture will become wealthy is very, very high. So, and a functional legal system is also a natural resource of tremendous, tremendous value. You know, it's partly why people in China, for example, wealthy people in China are dumping their money into the real estate market in North America like mad, because one of the things you do know if you buy real estate in North America is you actually own it. It's still going to be yours 20 years in the future, or 30 years in the future. There's no doubt about that. And so that fact of ownership is embedded in the functioning legal system. And that's what gives those sorts of properties crazy value. You know, much to the problematic situation for all of you people who are, at some point, most of you are going to try to buy property in Toronto, and that's really going to be entertaining. Now back out here in paradise, I mean, look at him. How pathetic can you get? Look at the expression on that creature's face. You know, he's sated like someone who's just eaten a gallon of ice cream, and he's got this pathetic, self-satisfied, naive, clueless, unconscious grin on his face, which the animators did a very nice job of capturing. Like, that's a complicated expression, and you just want to slap him. And that's exactly what should happen, and that's exactly what does happen. So anyways, he's out there being unconscious dingbat. Well, his society is degenerating, and that's bloody well worth thinking about, because that's an archetypal trope, right? It's like things are sinking around you. The question is, what are you doing about it? You know, are you just staying in kind of a blithe unconsciousness because you can get your next meal, or are you going to wake up and do something about it? Well, that's the call of the self. So now we go back to Rafiki here, and he knows what's going on in the kingdom. He's a symbol of the self. And he also has some inkling that Simba is still alive. So the son of the king is still alive, despite the fact that the land has become ruled by a tyrant and the son is absent. So let's say you've become an adolescent, you're all cynical, right? And everything's falling apart around you, which is the typical state of human beings, right? Because adolescents are cynical, generally speaking, and everything's falling apart around them, generally speaking. And so what do you have to do in order to do something about that? Well, one is you have to be drawn by the call of wisdom, and the other part is that you have to rediscover that part of yourself that's a childlike part, that's associated with the sun and associated with that early, the early exposure of Simba to the sun. You have to find that again, and then trust that some childlike exploration and a bit of manifestation of faith might get you to the next place.